to everybody who's here today and to anybody who's watching. Thank you for coming to watch our event, our speaker colloquium at Ottawa Dialogue on locally driven peace processes. So we started organizing this series of events to promote some of the research that the Ottawa Dialogue has been publishing. We do 3 policy briefs every year, ramping up our operations even more. And so we have a wonderful slate of different speakers today who will be talking about their work on local processes. So we'll introduce each one of them in a few minutes, but I just wanted to say first a little bit about Ottawa Dialogue. So Ottawa Dialogue was founded in 2009. It's a university-based organization at the University of Ottawa that brings together research and action in the field of dialogue and mediation, specifically in track 2 diplomacy. And so guided by the needs and the parties in the conflict, Ottawa Dialogue develops and carries out quiet and long-term dialogue-driven initiatives throughout the world. But in addition to that, like I mentioned earlier, we have a research branch where we're highlighting the work of scholars and practitioners in the field. And so we are very happy to welcome today Dr. Margarita Tadevosyan, Ms. Salma Yusuf, and Ms. Lena Dedyukina. And so we'll be hearing from each of them today. We're going to be going for about an hour. And so we have about 10 to 15 minutes for each speaker to talk about their policy brief. I know that everyone can speak for maybe for an hour on each one, and so we want to make sure that we kind of just do some of the highlights, and so that we leave space, maybe about 20 minutes at the end for discussion and for questions, maybe synthesizing some of the different insights from each policy brief. So without further ado, then I think we will start. So I think maybe first we'll have Margarita, then Salma, then Lena. So I will briefly introduce each speaker, sorry, the light. I'll briefly introduce each speaker, and then they will go ahead and present on their brief. So first is Dr. Margarita Tadevosyan. She's a research assistant professor at Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, but she's also the executive director of the Center of Peacemaking Practice. She is a scholar practitioner, and she focuses especially on the South Caucasus and in the post-Soviet space. So Margarita, thank you for being with us today. You said you don't have any slides right now, yes?
No, thank you. Thank you for invitation. No, and I don't have.
Perfect. So please, yes.
Thank you very much. And I think this topic is very dear to my heart in terms of like talking about locally led peace processes. I have an upcoming book that is investigating and looking at the understanding of effectiveness and local peace and what evidence looks on the local level, building on the years of research that I was doing around this topic, and I'm very excited to talk about it, especially in the domain where we speak about relationship and partnership between local organizations and international donors. From a first glance, it's a kind of a natural relationship, but when you look more deeper into how this relationship evolves, it is not as it's not free of conflict, if you will, in that sense. There is a lot of power asymmetry that exists between international donors and local organizations. And unfortunately, currently, at least in the areas that I am familiar and I've been working in, there is a very much donor-driven agenda for peace-building work, and some areas of focus are very much reflecting norms and values that are introduced by donors, which not always translate into local context the way they're supposed to. And also, we all know peace building work is not an easy work to do. Local organizations take a lot of risk when they engage in peace building activities. It is most of the time we're talking about violent conflict, about highly politicized conflict, and working with the quote-unquote enemy puts the local organizations in danger, and they have to navigate their local terrain with their own local governments, but also the local terrain in terms of the population, because they are citizens and representatives of those native communities. while obviously donors are not bound, they have foreign passports, they can come in, go out when things get really heated, but the locals have to stay and deal with the consequences. So a lot of times when there is this push for creativity, or push for more, for including, or what is now a very popular term that is being used, intersectionality, when you're introducing different kind of problematic areas and trying to work simultaneously in this various directions. In some context, that doesn't translate to a meaningful work. And again, I think I highlighted in my policy briefs, one of the things that was really tricky in the South Caucasus context. There was a big push for LGBTQ inclusion in the peace building process, and like working on that intersectionality. But Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia are very traditional societies. LGBTQ rights are very marginalized. The group themselves is very marginalized, and that not only created more marginalization, and but also put target on the back of the those organizations who chose to work in that direction without major added value to the process, if not like public pushback towards not only, again, the human rights issues for the LGBTQ community, but also the peace process itself and peace building itself. So I think that's a big disconnect when there is the understanding of universal human values, universal human rights. We need to think more creatively how those can be incorporated, and what is the timing, and what is the specific context where those things can come into play. And I think here is what I mean by saying that we donors need to transition from call for proposals that exist right now that are targeting specific interest areas that they have, to more flexible funding opportunities around bigger themes, where the local organizations can come with their own understanding of those themes and discuss with the donors. I think right now the biggest issue is this kind of the channel of communication is asymmetric and one-sided. It is a call for proposal to which local organizations respond, either get selected, they don't get selected. Sometimes they get a very generic response if they was not selected, but there is no space for conversation and working. In most of the cases, there is no space for conversation and trying to figure out what it makes sense, both for the donors, obviously, and also for the local communities. And I think this is one thing that needs to change. I do realize that there's a lot of work, that's much more work on the part of the donor organizations, because they have to create those kind of conversation spaces where they can go back and forth and discuss, which again, we're most of the time dealing with bureaucratic organizations that have certain fiscal year timeframes and like policy timeframes. But if we're talking about meaningful change, if we're talking about impact, this is the shift that needs to happen for us to see the impact. The second thing that I wanted to mention is the ability of local and international partners to communicate in what I call local language. But when I say that, it doesn't really mean like the Russian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, or like Ukrainian. I mean understanding what certain things mean in a particular context. That's very important. Things don't, first of all, we have the vocabulary that comes with a peace building. It is very much developed in the West. I speak 3 languages fluently. I have very difficult time, even in my native language, translating these terms and explaining what they mean. They don't really translate very easily. And also, I'll bring you very simple example. The Russian word for peacekeeper is actually verbatim peacemaker. So, and then when it's confusing. So when then you have to come up with something different that is peacemaking. So, but and those things get complicated. But with all of that said, we have this uh, um, certain organizations who have been doing this for a long time have learned how to navigate that, but navigate that on the terms of the funder, obviously, and include those like the lingo that resonates with the donors, but that does not mean that it resonates with their work and with their community. And a lot of times we're bound with this with the requirement of like we report in a way that fits a certain matrix, it fits the matrix of like monitoring and evaluation, which leaves out so much context that makes that report really irrelevant to grasp and to represent what is happening. And so what I feel strongly, and which I try to emphasize every time I had an opportunity to speak with a donor, that there needs to be a transition, or at least some type of combination of a storytelling component when there is a huge narrative thing where the implementer can tell the story from the beginning till the end, what happened, and not be bound by I need to fill this indicator, this output, this outcome format, which will add, first of all, context, but so much value, and will show actually the impact and the change that is happening in the community. Because a lot of times it's very difficult to grasp in those terms. I will say one final thing is that I feel that there is all of these problems are basically the fact that there is a big disconnect between the funding organizations, major donors, and local organizations by their physical separation. A lot of times donors don't have offices, let's say, with all the great work that, for example, Robert Stiftung is funding. They don't have a local representation, let's say, in Armenia, or it's one person, so they really don't understand what is happening in the ground. And when they receive a proposal, something looks good if it falls within a general thing that they have been seeing, but they might not really understand what is a specific issue in the community that they're targeting. And then other times we have donors coming in for a couple of days, having consultations. And again, I will emphasize that those consultations usually are I would not exaggerate if I say like in 90% of the cases with the same people who talk to same donor, like same NGOs, because they, again, like they are versed in English, they know how to talk to donors, and then they create a specific direction, and they kind of are the main channel of communication with the funders, and creating more direct, regular, even outside of funding cycles, communication opportunities for a wide range of local actors is really, really important if we want, first of all, to diversify, second of all, to understand what really the local needs are at different levels. Because again, like going back to Armenia, which is facing this challenge of another war and recovering from 2020 war, things that are important for the Armenian for a specific community in the south might not be the same things, again, in the overall peace building scheme for those communities, let's say, that border Georgia. So it's different. So that's why, again, like communication and having opportunity to have that feedback cycle, to have that a way of engaging with each other that is not specifically for solicitation and like purposes is very important, I believe, based on what I see in my work and how I engage with some of the local partners that we work in the South Caucasus. I'll stop here, and then I'm happy to take any further questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Margarita. So again, this was from taking from the research from her policy brief, Local Peace Actors and External Funding Mechanisms Towards Greater Agency for Local Actors. If you have questions, I know that I certainly have questions. Actually, I think one thing that really resonates with me is this idea of transitioning from perhaps a more traditional indicator-based approach to storytelling, to relationship building, to hearing the total context of different projects. And that's, I don't know, if we were sitting over tea, I would certainly love to hear more about that in particular. For people who do have questions, though, I encourage you to start writing them in the chat so we can start assembling the questions for the question period at the end. We're actually going to go next to Salma. So Salma Yusuf is here to present her occasional paper, Women Moving from Track 2 to Track 1 Peacemaking. She is a human rights specialist, a lawyer, and a peace practitioner from Sri Lanka. She specializes in policy and process development, program and project implementation, research, strategic advocacy, and thought leadership. So Salma, please tell us about your occasional paper.
Thank you, Josh, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to participants from around the world. It's 7:50 p.m. in Colombo, Sri Lanka, where I'm talking to you from, and I bring you greetings from my country. Thank you all for your interest in listening to us today. To speak about my policy brief, I would like to share that my policy brief is inspired mainly from my personal insights and experiences. It also draws on research, but it draws on secondary research, but mainly it draws on insights from my personal experience of moving from track 2 roles in civil society peacemaking to the formal track 1 process. So I've been working in, and that's the context, the personal context that I would like to share with you, is that I've been working in civil society, academia, media, activism, and advocacy, thought leadership in various roles at track 2 and beyond. And in 2015, when Sri Lanka saw a democratic revolution, Sri Lanka became an exception in the world. When the world was moving towards electing populist leaders and governments, Sri Lanka became an exception and brought into power a government of good governance. And in this wave of good governance, I was one of them who was called into public office. So I was called into public office by former president of Sri Lanka, Madam Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga, who is Asia's first woman president and Sri Lanka's first woman president. So she headed the Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, and she invited me to be the deputy director of the office. My main task and role during that time was to lead the drafting and development of Sri Lanka's first national policy on reconciliation. And that, together with other roles in government, is where I draw my insights from for the policy brief. And that is the context that I wanted to share with you today. So in the policy brief and in my advocacy for women's movement from track 2 to track 1, I always say that the premise is that women should not just be included for tokenism. We need to move beyond tokenism and include women, I argue, not only as participants or even active participants in these processes, but I argue in this policy brief and in all my work on the need for women to take on leadership roles in peacemaking. So I argue that the time has come for women to take on leadership roles. We have moved beyond tokenism, and we are somewhere, I feel, in that space of participation. Sometimes it's tokenistic, sometimes it's meaningful, sometimes it's a mix of both. But I believe it's time to take leadership, and it's happening, and it's important to strengthen such efforts. Drawing from my own personal experience, I found that being given the power of the pen to lead a national policy process was an example and a milestone for not only myself at a personal level, having emerged from a triple minority background in my country. So I come from a triple minority background, that is a religious minority, ethnic minority, and a linguistic minority background. So from a personal point of view, it was a milestone, but also nationally and regionally, because I believe this is the first national policy on reconciliation in Asia as well. So a woman taking leadership in peacemaking through policy processes is an example which I feel and I like to, and I'm keen to share experiences with the world. And that's what I have documented in this policy brief. As you will see in my remarks, I just keep moving from the personal to the professional because it is relevant to what I have shared in the policy brief, since I'm drawing on my insights and also wanting to highlight how important the personal is when you're bringing it into the public and the professional space and the policy space as a woman moving from informal roles at track 2 level to track 1 level. I mean, women, and the idea behind actually this particular focus in this policy brief is inspired by the fact that women have been traditionally confined to informal roles at track 2 levels and below. There is now beginning very slowly a movement into formal roles. However, this is still viewed with skepticism, with a lot of challenge in all parts of the world, and especially in parts of the world in the Southern Hemisphere, in the global South, where I come from, it is not still as commonplace as I feel it should be. However, with this movement into formal roles, I would still say that there is a long way to go anywhere in the world where women exert influence and leadership, and give leadership, not only in terms of position or power or status, but also in terms of being drawn on for their technical expertise. And this is something I emphasize. Most recently, I was invited to present and share my perspectives and opinion paper as a perspective from the global South to the government of Scotland's imminent feminist foreign policy. And I argue that the global South should not, and women included, and especially women, should not just be resorted to as sources of data or evidence or just for their perspectives, but they should be called upon for their technical competence, for their technical expertise. And that's how you actually give agency. That's how you also lend and provide leadership, because this traditional idea of leadership is just about being in certain positions, in certain seats of power and holding designation and title. While that is important too, and that does have an important role to play, I feel there is not much focus on the importance that women can play in terms of the technical competence they can bring into the policy processes, into peace processes and peacemaking. So that is something I argue for in this paper. When it comes to the case for building, for women, exerting leadership in peace processes, informal processes, and for movement from track 2 to track 1 and exerting leadership, I mean, there is ample research on that. There is no doubt, and it's beyond question, that women's inclusion in peace processes leads to stronger outcomes, leads to more inclusive clauses in agreements, leads to more sustainable processes, leads to more buy-in, and leads to resilient communities. However, I highlight a few in the paper in terms of the strategic approaches that I found through my experience that women bring to peace processes. Women, for the most part, and here I would always say for the most part, or by and large, of course there are exceptions, but when compared with the male counterparts, I have found that women bring in a non-partisan approach. They tend to work towards consensus building in their work, and then they tend to be less motivated by political factors and considerations. They are often viewed, and this is a big one, with more trust and with more altruism. And I found this even for myself, the importance of trust that is built in those who invite you and call you into power and give you the space to exert and influence and lead peace processes is critical. So the element of trust, I feel, is critical. In terms of, in the interest of time, I will just highlight what I see as those aspects that can be harnessed in terms of women who are working in informal track 2 levels, and which they can harness to propel them into formal track 1 roles. One is, of course, that women tend to have a heightened awareness of the issues from when they have worked in informal processes. They have already built networks of support and solidarity, both in country, across borders, and across sectors. So they already have these strategic alliances, which they carry with them when they move into formal roles. And women and men who have not had this space or this experience at the track 2 levels, and they just parachute directly into formal roles, I find that this is a huge gap, a huge lacuna that they miss when they move there. And these, I have found in my own personal experiences that the alliances that I built across the variety of stakeholder groups and networks held me in a very good place when I was holding public office and leading the process of national reconciliation policy, because the buy-in, the trust is already there, and then the people are willing to rally around you. Women also tend to be more socially connected and connected to communities and society. So they tend to bring in a more nuanced, sensitive approach and sophisticated understanding of issues. The conflict prevention capacities that women bring in depicts their society's understanding of gender norms. So women bring in these perspectives naturally by virtue of the fact of being women, and also if they do represent women. And also, like I mentioned before, this element of trust, and especially when it comes to bureaucracies and the suspicion, the skepticism that is there, that, those in bureaucracy and public positions and power are not always genuine or sincere. I find that women adopt creative approaches and tend to focus a lot on the relational aspects. And when this is combined with the technical competence and expertise and the focus on good process, I feel it's immensely powerful. And then that is what I feel lends great influence and leadership to processes. So I will leave it at that for now, Josh, and happy to answer questions in Q&A. Thank you.
Perfect. And what I liked about what you were speaking about, Salma, is that you were also speaking about concrete examples from your own experience. And I hope that we have some time in the discussion to maybe unpack some of the things that you saw. But before that, we have one more speaker. And so next we are going to be hearing from Ms. Lena Dedyukina. And she has for us an annotated bibliography called Indigenous Knowledge and Conflict Resolution. And so Lena is a graduate research assistant with Ottawa Dialogue and also an MA candidate in geography at the University of Ottawa. And from what I understand, will be hopefully receiving her degree very soon. So best of luck with you with that. And so please take the floor and tell us about your paper.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for inviting me to talk during this event. It's quite exciting to share. It's actually, I'm sharing today results of my literature review, which I completed last year. And for that, I actually have a presentation. So let me know if you see the slides.
Yes, we do.
Awesome. Okay. Let me move these things here so I can see. Okay. So as Josh said already, right? And so my name is Lena Dedyukina, and I'm a master's student at the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics. And today I'm presenting you the results of the literature review on Indigenous conflict resolution and peacebuilding practices. So I want to start with this presentation from my positionality. I consider myself an Indigenous woman belonging to Yakut Sakha ethnicity from the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia in the northeast part of Russia. And in this sense, we're probably related to Margarita because I also speak almost 3 languages fluently. I speak Russian and English. And this is on the map here. You can see this red dots. It is a city of Yakutsk. It's my hometown. And the town of Palatak, where I was conducting our collaborative research project. So I completed my undergraduate studies at the University of Ottawa. Currently, I'm finishing my master's thesis in geography with food security project evaluating a cooking circle program in the hamlet of Paulatak, Northwest Territories. Understanding Indigenous peoples' history in Canada, I support and promote community-based initiatives and research as acts of self-determination and Indigenous community resilience. With an effort to decolonize academic research, I recognize the importance of honoring and building respectful and reciprocal relationships with all Indigenous peoples in Canada, including Algonquin and Anishinaabe people who are the guardians of this land that is unceded. And I'm talking from Ottawa now, and Ottawa is located on the land of Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So there were 4 topics identified during the literature review in terms of Indigenous knowledge and conflict resolution practices. The first topic is about the importance of relationality, self-governmentality, and restorative justice, with the focus on the significance of the concept "I am because we are" that represents the value of communal relationships. The second topic relates to Indigenous perceptions of conflict and peace, with rituals and emotions as important aspects of conflict resolution. The third topic is about Indigenous conflict resolution practices and their transformation and adaptation in terms of modern processes. And the fourth topic is related to the aspects of land treaties and reconciliation. And I'll try to go over these 4 topics as quick as possible. So in terms of the first topic, the study shows that conflict understanding in its social context is necessary to find solutions without the implication of the universality of liberal Western approaches. In this sense, the root of the conflict must be analyzed not from the immediate cause as a one-off event, but from the web of relationships that deteriorated at the time of the conflict. Indigenous conflict resolution practices emphasize a community-based approach to conflict resolution instead of an individual-based approach that minimizes traditional values and shifts the necessity to resolve the conflict from restoring the relationships to individual claims and interests. Indigenous conflict resolution practices require the participation of many actors, in fact, the entire community, based on local traditions and culture. The studies show that Indigenous conflict resolution practices tend to be holistic in nature, including rational, emotional, artistic, religious, and spiritual aspects to resolve conflicts and reconcile people, contrary to mainstream conflict resolution, which considers rational political initiatives as superior to non-rational ones. Indigenous approaches to conflict resolution would be better described as conflict transformation. They prioritize ways of addressing the conflict to heal relationships and bring harmony to the group instead of reaching an agreement. Here we're talking about the importance of keeping mind, body, emotion, and spirit in balance to be whole, happy, and healthy. When these aspects of self are repressed or weakened, it can affect not only an individual's health and well-being, but also impair an individual's relationships with others and the world. This concept of relationality implies that everything exists in relation to something else in the web of life. When we're talking about the communality and relationality of Indigenous societies, it's important to point out that it does not imply coercion on personal autonomy. Contrary, autonomy in the Indigenous context is a significant aspect of self-governmentality that represents a form of self-regulation and internal control that does not require other forms of enforcement. This sense of responsibility for your behavior is an essential element of children's upbringing in Indigenous communities, with a sense of being your own boss. Autonomy is significant for conflict management because it is synonymous with the self-regulation and Confucian concept of do not do to others what you yourself do not desire. That represents a positive cycle of reciprocal responsiveness between self and others as a prerequisite for cooperative or peaceful outcomes. Indigenous conflict resolution practices tend to follow restorative justice approaches instead of Western punitive justice. Rather than punishing or correcting the wrongdoer separately, it is more crucial to reestablish and strengthen relations among the parties. The courts and justice systems are incapable of reaching citizens' emotional, cognitive, and behavioral processes at every level, so achieving restorative justice is incredibly difficult. In the view of many Indigenous people, the Western courts are hard-hearted, cold, and calculating due to their insistence on maintaining high levels of impartiality and emotional restraint. So instead of apportioning blame and enforcing order, restorative justice provides ground for reconciliation and restoration of harmony and social balance. So in relation to the second topic of the literature review, studies show that in Australia, many Aboriginal groups value conflict as an integral part of human existence. An acceptable amount of conflict that does not impact the wider social order is considered normal. However, it is necessary to point out that it does not mean that conflict is regarded as natural or preferable, rather it's seen as normal and acceptable. Concurrently, the concept of peace is understood somewhat differently in African societies, with the main idea that peace is not only the absence of widespread physical violence and existence of rational order, but the restoration of harmonious relationships between members of the community that is not merely tolerance for each other, but deep, truthful acceptance and forgiveness involving hard emotional labor on the part of the participants in the conflict, including their family members and the whole community. Exchanges of material goods, gifts, and other forms of compensation instead of vengeful violence symbolically represent the restoration of relations between conflict parties in social harmony. These gift-giving practices can be considered superficial without genuine acceptance or forgiveness. Rituals that involve sharing food and drink allow the parties to exchange reconciliation gestures. The sacred pipe ceremony that is the First Nations implemented during peace treaty discussions started with a messenger delivering a gift of tobacco that later was cut and mixed with other herbs and signified truthfulness, respect, and acceptance of the meeting's decisions and agreements. Concurrently, ceremonies and rituals serve as pathways for parties to strengthen mutual understanding, restore fractured relationships, and mark the end point of a dispute in a culturally meaningful way. Observing spiritual ceremonies, rituals, and rites is essential to guarantee that one's commitment goes beyond the physical to the spiritual level. Trying to suppress spiritual aspects merely because mainstream experts cannot understand them could be counterproductive, considering that spiritual reasons and beliefs still play a significant role in people's lives, regardless of their scientific validity. In addition to creating an environment of trust, the ceremony signals the resolution of the conflict and restoration of harmony. As symbolic practices, these activities of commitment and trust are more meaningful and more powerful than statements or writings. Additionally, studies show that Indigenous conflict resolution practices promote the expression of emotions as an integral part of the process, with encouragement to release emotions during the resolution process, or even purging of emotions. It is a significant difference between Indigenous and liberal conflict resolution mechanisms, with punishment-oriented Western liberal approaches based on suppression of emotions, analytical reasoning, and order. Freedom of expression is crucial for managing conflict, considering that those who fail to have their perspectives heard often turn to violence. However, participants in disputes are encouraged to spend some time calming their emotions before approaching the opponent. Now we are moving to the third topic of the literature review. Conflicts happening in the pre-contact era are not similar to the conflict situations currently happening in the Indigenous context. Modern conflicts are exacerbated by disadvantages such as overcrowded and poor or inappropriate housing in stressful or culturally isolated environments, financial and health problems that are compounded by adverse circumstances, inadequate access to education, environmental racism, high rates of food insecurity, unemployment, substance abuse, and others. The socioeconomic hardships and environmental and political issues are strikingly similar for all Indigenous peoples worldwide. So contemporary conflict resolution processes have to address the cultural needs of the conflict participants and take into account socioeconomic, health, environmental, and other causes that directly and indirectly trigger conflicts. Even though the traditionality of Indigenous knowledge denotes old and aging, Indigenous knowledge is still relevant in current circumstances. It is significant to point out that concepts of openness, adaptability, and transformation are not novel in Indigenous conflict resolution practices. Realistic perception of peace as a never static or secure process influences its desire to be maintained, preserved, recovered, and spread. This process of maintenance, preservation, and readjustment is a long process of transformation, not only in terms of personal changes, but on the level of family, community, and nation-to-nation relationships. Several studies in Africa emphasize the need to challenge patriarchal traditional systems that silence the voices of women and youth. However, even though women in many traditional conflict resolution practices do not play leadership roles and cannot be chosen as elders, Their supporting role as valuable participants in the restoration of relationships is on knowledge and the conflict resolution practices. The role of Haudenosaunee women in the Great Law of Peace is a considerable North American example of women's significant contribution to the peacemaking processes as mediators. In this context, hospitality, food preparation, and offerings as major functions carried out by women are essential in any peacemaking process. Concurrently, Haudenosaunee mother rule system was organized to maintain an equal social, economic, spiritual, and political balance between men and women. And in
So
relation
Lena,
to
we have about a minute left.
yeah, so I'm quickly
About that.
trying to use that one. So in relation to the fourth topic of the literature review, it is significant to point out that land is an important factor when we talk about conflict resolution and indigenous knowledge. Indigenous peoples view themselves as part of the land, environment, and nature. In this context, the relationship with the land implies its perception as an integral part of balance and harmony. It is important to mention that Turo Wampum, one of the oldest treaty relationships between indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, which is called North America, and European immigrants, considered as a foundational philosophical principle a universal relationship of non-domination, balance, and harmony between different forces that proclaim fundamental aspects of peace, respect, and friendship in any relationship, including nation to nation and between people and environment, more than 400 years ago. And just to finish this presentation, I wanted to say that on June 21, 2021, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP Act, became a legal reconciliation framework as a key step in renewing the government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation requires relearning history, challenging attitudes and values, and accepting the shared we are all treaty people's identity to develop a relationship based on mutual acknowledgement, recognition, respect, sharing, and responsibility. At the same time, reconciliation requires socioeconomic changes and later institutions based on recognition of Indigenous rights, titles, culture, and identity. Indigenous knowledge must be accepted and recognized in partnership and fellowship with other knowledge systems to achieve meaningful communication in the land claims context or any other negotiation. Specifically, Indigenous knowledge must be recognized, respected, and considered equally to Western scientific knowledge for reconciliation as a requirement for lasting peace to happen. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lena. And thank you to all three of our presenters today, speaking about these different aspects of what locally driven peace processes can look like. So we heard first from Margarita about the relationship between donors and local actors. We heard from Salma about the role of women in track 2 and track 1 processes. And then now from Lena about the role of Indigenous practices and their relationship to Western ones. So now it's we have about a bit less than 15 minutes for questions. And so if anybody would like to just raise their hand to ask a question, or you can write it in the chat, we'll give some space for that right now. If not, I certainly have my own questions, but we want to make sure everyone has a chance for that too. So maybe while we're waiting for questions, I'm really curious about some success stories and examples from all three of your spaces. So anyone can start, but for example, Margarita, if there's examples of good relations between like donors and local peace builders that you've seen, or Salma, more about the Sri Lankan processes that you're a part of, and Lena, if there are good examples of cooperation between, for example, Indigenous processes in Canada with more national ones, anyone can speak up.
I want to say that in my case, I want to emphasize that it also depends. Personalities matter. It depends who works for the certain donor organization. For example, we several years ago we had an incredible person who was working for the UK government at the they had at that point conflict pool program that was funding the conflict resolution work, peace building work in the region, based in Tbilisi, and that person had academic background, first of all, and also was very interested in the work himself. So he made that purposeful effort of trying to connect with people. I think under his leadership, what they have created was they brought together all the grantees that they funded to Tbilisi to talk about their work, to present on their work. So not only that the funder knows what they're doing, but also other people in the region, not only in Georgia, but in Azerbaijan, in Armenia, knows what this organization is doing. So I think that was an incredible effort. I am not sure that has continued after this person departed. So I feel that the challenge here, it was a great experience. It was really important. It actually changed a lot of things, but what that it didn't translate in like a policy, like it not a policy, but I guess policy approach for the embassy that moved forward or carried on. Again, I might be wrong, maybe that's still happening. I haven't heard about it recently, but again, like COVID has changed so much. But on the other hand, one policy success that is it's very important to me, and it clearly indicated that donors actually listened in a very different direction. But again, the UK embassy, I'm praising the UK now, but the UK embassy, they have this Chevening scholarship that is awarded for master's degree in the UK for a year or two. Previously it was excluding, there was a political issue of like people, youth from Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia and South Ossetia being to apply because they can't apply for like as Armenian or as George, like they either have to choose to be Georgian or Russian. They cannot apply with their own kind of national identity, which was a very important thing for them. So UK embassy actually heard that, incorporated in their work, translated back to London to their respective kind of leadership, and there was a policy change. Now you can apply for Chevening scholarship, that you can either choose Armenia, Azerbaijan, or Georgia as your country that you are applying, or you can choose South Caucasus, which is not it's not recognizing any statehood, but also gives those youth who is not comfortable choosing one or the other still have the opportunity. And I feel that is an incredible change of showing how funders is actually listening and understanding what the needs are and what is important in terms of like a value system for the local communities.
Perfect. Thank you, Margarita. And we also have a question in the comments from Colin to Salma about what can be done to support women in peace processes and diplomacy. So, Salma.
Yes, thank you, George. Just before answering Colin's question, and it might also answer to that, I wanted to share that you were asking about successful case studies, and I wanted to share two approaches which I found are very useful in terms of promoting women's leadership in peace processes and women's meaningful participation and contribution is what I mean by leadership in peace processes. And that is for women to not only speak on women's issues and not to only speak on behalf of women, but for women to speak on behalf of everyone. So the positioning, how we women peacemakers position ourselves is critical. We need to position ourselves as equal stakeholders with equal agency to speak on behalf of everyone on the issues that confront and the issues that affect everyone. So when we speak only on women's issues, we are reinforcing the sidelining of women to speak only on women's issues. So I would like to propose that we challenge this trend of women speaking only on women's issues, but to speak on broader issues. And also the flip side to that will be one answer to Colin's question, and that is for individuals who want to support women's work in peacemaking to be strategic allies. And what that would mean is to support women in every way possible, and to endorse and to celebrate and to verbalize and get behind what they're trying to do. So women tend to rely a lot on networks of solidarity, and these tend to be mainly comprised, from what I have seen, of other women. But when there are male allies, and that is something Colin could also do in groups of males, and where males are helped to rally more males who will support women's efforts, where women's involvement and women's leadership in peace processes becomes everybody's business. So when males and strategic allies speak about women's involvement, it's the flip side of what I said earlier. Of course, there are a range of ways of supporting and contributing to women's role in peacemaking, and I'm open to Colin or anyone else reaching out to me, and I'm happy to continue the conversation and see how we can support the cause. Thank you.
Thank you, Salma. And so we have one more question in the chat. We only have time for one more, I think, for us, and it's about this tension that can sometimes exist between trying to push for a meaningful inclusion of minorities, whether it's women, whether it's ethnic or political minorities, but also the tension that desire has with the political realities on the ground that sometimes resist that, if I'm understanding your question correctly for us. So are there paths that allow for the respect of local contexts and more simultaneously push for more meaningful inclusion? So this question is open to anyone. I know, Lena, you haven't answered anything yet, so if you also want to add your input onto this question, but otherwise it's open for all.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, like in terms of the positive examples, because like my presentation was just on a literature review, which is kind of like looking at mostly at the academic works and whatever was written in in this period of time in terms of indigenous conflict resolution practices. But this project actually, what we are kind of doing right now, like and I'm kind of part of that, we're doing this Ottawa Dialogue. We actually kind of working now on with the community of Kahnawake in Montreal, the south part of Montreal, and we are kind of looking at the, track to diplomacy and indigenous Kahnawake, like more related to Kahnawake community, how they approach this conflict resolution processes, and kind of looking at how there is like some kind of commonalities, or how these two ways of dialogue can inform each other. And this is I'm finding it's very in terms of it's very positive, and it's actually how this project actually moving forward, and we are trying. I mean, this is a lot of work ahead, and it's relationship building process with indigenous communities is a very long process. So this is how I was saying that relationality is very important when we are approaching communities like indigenous communities in this context. It's not like you just I come and I have the solutions for you, blah blah blah. Have to consider culture, local dynamics, and as Salma was saying, like women's inclusion, it's very interesting. I had conversation with one of the elders of the community, and she was saying that she had like a group of volunteers who were supporting conflict resolution processes in community on a local basis, and most of them were women, and the women were actually volunteering. So it was actually quite interesting to hear, and it's something I actually looking forward to is investigating more and examining. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Lena. I know that we're getting close to our time, so if anybody has to drop off, feel free, but we want to make sure we finish just these last few questions before officially signing off, so we might be a couple of minutes more. Margarita, I saw that your hand was up.
Yes, I mean, so the other question about like different minorities, and again, obviously different groups and different minorities will require a different approach. But since we're talking about women, I wanted to kind of say, drawing on what Lena has also presented about the tapping into Indigenous, and again, Indigenous is usually used in a particular context, but I want to say like local traditions and approaches that would allow for women participation. I think in many contexts, women have a special role. There is a respect towards them on a different level. It's not the respect we have seen or we frame in the kind of Western terms, but with even lower social status, women still have certain type of respect and roles in their communities. That's certainly true in the South Caucasus, obviously. And I feel that it is about finding what is the leadership role that that the local communities assign to women, and work around those leadership roles as an entry point to push them forward. Like the role of a mother, the role of like a kind of a family holding together is a big thing in Armenia. What prevents all of this to be meaningful, and I will say this, I'm being very open, there is this big push for UN Security Resolution 1325. They push it really hard, which is very important, but it is pushed, it is the way it is presented, the way it is packaged and introduced oftentimes is seen as destroying traditional values of the society and creates a lot of resistance. I don't think there is a resistance for women building peace and being included. It is the resistance of how the 1325's advertisement is perceived in the societies. And this is what I mean. We need to work to repackage those concepts in a way that resonates, because again, I feel that societies and communities have local points of entry. It is a matter of finding them, finding the right points of entry instead of just kicking the door and getting in, finding that to be able to work.
Perfect. And then we'll have one last comment from Salma on this, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Yes, thanks, Josh. I just wanted to add to what Margarita said, and this is something I did highlight in my paper as well, how the terms of reconciliation, peace building, for example, that's a huge challenge I had. Reconciliation, transitional justice, there are no local terms for it. So to actually sell it to the people, to the masses, especially when you're in government, was an arduous task. And as Margarita rightly mentioned, when women, peace and security and international norms and standards are being communicated to the local communities, it's so important. And this is what and where I feel women can play a leadership role in bridging this gap. So drawing and showing the local relevance of these instruments, of these resolutions, and also to show how these ideas and the values enshrined in these instruments are not alien or new to the societies and communities we are working in. They're just packaged differently and they're just labeled and named differently, but we've had this in our cultures and traditions for years and generations. So that is an approach that I find that women tend to do, is to exert leadership in building these gaps and, translating in terms of practice and theory, these international norms and standards to reflect and resonate with local realities. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Salma. Two things that resonated with me from these questions was the need to find local entry points, but also the strategic allies and the role that they have to play. So thank you very much to all three of our speakers. This has been the third of our 4 speaker colloquium meetings at Ottawa Dialogue. Our last one will be on May 30th with Dr. Evan Hoffman on Power and Track 2. And so more information on that soon. Please register and feel free to come out. And thank you very much again to our speakers. And that's it from our end.